All right, welcome. So today we will be starting our study of AP microeconomics and macroeconomics. So we're going to start off with basic economic concepts, and this is essentially like AP micro and macro combined. Like this is the unit 1 like combined. So this will basically branch off into both macro and micro. We'll start with micro, do that for about 5 days, and then we will do macro for the next 5 days. And then we'll have a review at the end of the course, which is going to be, we're going to go over an AP test. We're going to try out practice problems. Essentially, any questions you have, we'll clear them up. So starting off, right? So the first topic is going to be regarding scarcity. So firstly, let's go over what exactly economics is. So economics is the science of scarcity, which essentially means that there's not enough resources for basically everyone to have exactly what they want. We have unlimited wants, but we have limited resources. So we have to find a way to allocate those resources. Since we're unable to have everything we desire, we must make choices on how to use those resources. So this is what the first topic will be about. So economics, is the study of choices. So in economics, we will do this through 2 ways. First, we'll start off with micro, right? Which is just going to be the study of businesses itself, right? So like, for example, if you have to choose between like buying jeans or buying shoes, right? These are 2 businesses. They will each like have their, like, that is what micro is covering. And then, so like businesses choosing how many people to hire, this is micro, right? Governments and like the big picture, right? Like our everyday thing, as you can see, like, Trump's been putting tariffs and stuff. All of that we're going to study in macro. So macro is like the big picture. So the textbook definition, right? Economics is a social science which is concerned with the efficient use of scarce resources to achieve maximum satisfaction of economic wants. Essentially, you want everyone to get like the maximum satisfaction out of the limited resources. So I already briefly touched on this right now, but essentially microeconomics is the study of like businesses, firms, and individuals, right? Individuals making choices between products, firms making decisions about their prices, and markets deciding like what to sell, when to sell it, and stuff like that, right? So supply and demand in specific industries, production costs, and labor markets. This is what micro covers. Now macro, like I said, is the study of the large economy as a whole, or economic aggregates. This word right here is like a vocab word. This will come later in macro unit 3, and we'll talk about things like aggregate supply, aggregate demand. But essentially, all you need to know, micro is the study of small businesses. Like if you are the owner of a business, you will be using microeconomics to perform like everything you need to like maximize your business profit and whatnot. And for macroeconomics is used, like, for example, if you are like a head of the government or something for the US, you will be using macroeconomics to decide like what tariffs you're going to put, what essentially like there's many things you will decide like through government. So think of micro businesses, macro is the government. So like economic growth, government spending, inflation, unemployment, and also trade. Like thinking of the country as a whole is macro. So economists use the scientific method to make generalizations and abstractions to develop theories, right? So for the most part, we will see like micro is more of a theoretical aspect, right? Like we're not going to be using this on our day-to-day lives. This is mainly for just businesses to like decide what decisions they make. But on the other hand, right? So like these are policy economics, right? And then, let me actually go back. And then macro, however, right? Macro is going to be regarding like Macro is going to be more like real life scenarios. Like we just touched on inflation and unemployment, but yeah, so inflation and unemployment are things that we think about in our everyday lives, and it's how we make decisions. So macro is going to be more like experimental economics. So now let's move on to like positive versus normative, right? So positive statements, of course, are based on facts and it avoids value judgments, right? This is stuff that you can test in real life. And just to make sure, this is all like at least 1.1 and 1.2, like don't like write everything down here. Just if you can just remember a couple of things, that's fine. The main focus for today will be like 1.3 through 1.6. Those are the stuff that actually appears on the AP test, right? And then, yeah, so like for example, unemployment rate is declining. This is like I said, macro, it's based off of facts. And then normative statements, right, or normative statements includes value judgments, which essentially means that it can't be tested or validated, but it's a theory. So, for example, as an unemployed worker should receive like financial assistance to help make ends meet, or everyone should work at a bank to earn the true value of money. Can't be tested or validated, but it's a theory, it's an educated theory. So here are the 5 key economic assumptions we make when we study economics. First, society has unlimited wants and limited resources. This is scarcity, right? Due to scarcity, choices must be made. Every choice has a cost. We'll learn like this is what we call an opportunity cost, right? Essentially, it's like a trade-off. Like for example, at a store, you can buy 1 apple or you can buy 1 banana, right? So if you buy the banana, the opportunity cost is you could have bought the apple, and so on and so forth. And then everyone's goal is to make choices that maximize their satisfaction. Everyone is selfish. That is how we think of economics. We don't think like, oh, okay, I want another person to like get the best deal, so I'm going to buy the more expensive thing. In economics, we assume everyone is selfish. They are doing it for their own self-interest. And number 4, everyone makes decisions by comparing their marginal costs and marginal benefits of every choice. Essentially what this means, right? At every step of the way, when you go to like, for example, purchase something from the store, you'll evaluate both of these, right? How much marginal benefit are you going to get from buying that banana? And does it make up for the cost of buying the banana, for example? So that's one example. But of course, we'll see this all throughout economics. And in fact, at least for micro, this basically is the building block for everything we do Unit 3, Unit 4, and beyond. And then, of course, real-life situations can be explained and analyzed through simplified models and graphs, right? So in Unit 1, we will be going over a graph called the production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier, right? This is going to be our first graph. It's going to be pretty simple, but know that in micro and macro, there are like tons of graphs, right? And essentially, it's best if you don't just memorize them, but actually like practice using them. But at least for now, this won't be a big concern. But later, once we get to stuff like macro, where we have like a Phillips curve, short run aggregate supply curve, and then like so many other things, like for example, if you have an average total cost curve, there's a lot of stuff that's going to come up. But for now, we are just concerned with one graph that is going to be our production possibilities curve. So this is also some quick economic terminology. Of course, don't write these down. This is just context for what we're going to cover later. So utility, marginal, and allocate, right? Utility is essentially like satisfaction, but also like the benefit you get. So marginal utility, if we combine those two words, like marginal is like additional, right? So if we say like marginal utility, it's the additional satisfaction you'll get from buying that banana. So utility is your benefit and marginal is every additional one, right? So for example, like in this case, just to give you an idea of marginal, if you think of like a graph, like for example, in like algebra 2, right? If you take the slope of that graph, this is what like marginal is, the slope at every process, right? This is like the additional, what you get from buying that extra banana, for example. And then allocate means to distribute the resources. Like, for example, if businesses want to split up the bananas or whatnot, like allocating, that's what allocate means. It's to just distribute the resources. So now let's move on to price versus cost. So what's the price versus how much does that cost? So in this case, right, price is simply just the amount the buyer or the consumer pays, right? It's what you see like banana selling for like $1 or $2. That $1, $2 is the price, right? Pretty simple. And then cost is the amount that the seller pays to produce that good, right? So essentially later in the unit, we'll go over how we're going to replace price with revenue when we look at it from a business standpoint, right? Revenue will be how much they get from each consumer buying one of their products. And cost is the amount it actually takes to produce that. So now let's go over investment. Investment is essentially the money spent by businesses to improve their production. Like, for example, if they have revenue collecting over time and they spend it on, for example, improving their technology, making that better, they'll be able to produce more, lower their costs, and thus they'll be able to increase their overall profit. So investment is the money spent by businesses to improve their production, at least from a micro standpoint. And then, so for example, if they had collected 1 million over their course of like profits and they pay that for a new factory, now their costs go down. So this is like investing essentially. And then consumer goods are goods that are created for direct consumption, right? So for example, like pizza, water, or anything you think of that you will directly for example, use. So it's not necessarily just food, but it's anything that like the business won't use, they are just selling that product to you. So for example, like an iPhone, right? They're not going to use that to make their business better. It is simply a consumer good that they're using to sell to you. So now there's this other thing called capital goods. This is essentially goods that are created for indirect consumption. Essentially, these are the goods that businesses use in order to like lower their costs, be more efficient. So, for example, like if they get a toaster versus just heating it on the stove, it'll be faster. So they'll reduce their costs, be able to produce more, get more revenue. So these are what capital goods are. So like the best example, the example we'll use everywhere is like a robot, for example. A robot, like normally you'd have to like pay a worker to like manufacture products, but like let's say you have a robot. That's the perfect example of a capital good. You are essentially increasing your efficiency because you don't have to pay the robot. The robot's just gonna make your life easier. You're gonna be able to produce more with less cost. That is essentially what capital goods do, right? And essentially the idea of the PPC, right? At least we'll see later. For now, we'll start with comparing two goods, but later we'll be essentially considering between capital and consumer goods. Like businesses could produce a lot of just the product that they're producing, or they could invest and make producing that product more efficient. So that is what our PPC will be used for later. So now let's go on to the 4 factors of production, right? So this will also show up later. So all resources can be classified as one of the following 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, but essentially, land is all the natural resources. Natural is the key word here. Resources that are used to produce goods and services. So essentially, land is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially like if the place you use to set up your factory, and then like the trees you use, and like the land you use, that it falls into the first category. Second category is labor. So any effort that like a person will devote to like working for your business, right? That is labor, right? And like I mentioned earlier with capital goods, right? This is one of the costs that will come up. So for example, if we have a robot, like I mentioned, capital good, right? This can reduce this labor aspect. So all three of these are costs. So, all four. We'll go over all four. But for now, the land will cost stuff, the resources will cost things. Now labor is also a cost. And then the third one is capital, right? We already covered this earlier, but capital, think of it as efficiency. You are essentially becoming more efficient. That's what it is, right? So physical capital is any human-made resource that's used to create other goods and services, or more consumer goods. So good examples of these are tools, tractors, machinery, buildings, and factories. These are built by hand, and these are like physically used to increase the amount being produced and lower the costs. And then human capital is essentially it's brain power, essentially the skills or knowledge gained through like education and experience. So for example, if you make a worker like toast a bunch of bread, right? But they don't know how a toaster works, it's going to cost more to like teach them how to use the toaster and stuff like that. But if they know at home how to use a toaster, they'll be able to toast bread much quicker because they'll be fully experienced in how to do that. So like the skills gained through education and experience, this will help reduce costs later. This is also a type of capital. And then the last one is entrepreneurship, right? Individuals who combine the other factors of production to create goods and services. So good examples of this are like Henry Ford, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. Essentially, those who own the businesses and those who like invent a new thing that will help reduce the costs, right? So yeah. So entrepreneurs, they take initiative, right? They innovate. They make something new that will help reduce the cost and increase the revenue. And they act as risk bearers. They are willing to take risks. So they obtain profit. They increase their profit. So this is the equation we'll be using to calculate profit, right? So revenue minus costs. So the goal for a business is, of course, to increase their profit, right? So we can do this in either two ways. This is a pretty simple equation. Either we increase the revenue or we decrease the costs. Basically, for example, for reducing costs, for example, if we have like toasters, for example, it won't cost as much. Like you can produce more in less time. Time is a cost as well, because like if you think about it, workers are paid let's say you're paid like $18 an hour. Essentially, that hour is a cost, right? It's a resource. So if you can decrease the time it takes to produce stuff, that's like lowering your costs. And a good example for revenue is the robot we mentioned earlier, right? If you have the human workers and then you bring in robots, right? You don't have to pay them. That's not increasing your costs at all. Instead, they're producing more. So you can sell more, which increases your revenue. So the goal for businesses is to increase their profit. They do so by either maximizing revenue or minimizing costs. So let's go on to productivity, right? Productivity is a measure of efficiency that shows the number of outputs per unit of input, right? So this is a good example. If Bob can make 10 pizzas in 1 hour, Stan can make 5 pizzas in 1 hour, Bob is more productive. Essentially, he'll be more efficient in a business. So businesses and countries want to improve their productivity since all resources are scarce. Like I mentioned earlier, time is a resource. So both of these guys can make 10 pizzas. Stan is using 1 more hour. He's using more resources. And time is also scarce. So now let's go on to topic 1.2, which is allocating these resources and the type of economic systems, right? So, like we mentioned earlier, scarcity means there isn't enough for everyone, right? So society must decide how their resources will be allocated and distributed. So every society must answer 3 questions. What goods and services should be produced? How should these goods and services be produced? And who consumes these goods and services? So the way these questions are answered determines the economic system. So here are the 3 economic systems. So the first one is like communism, Soviet Union, China, Cuba. Think of that, right? Second economic system is capitalism. And third economic system is like a mix of the 2. So let's start off with communism, right? So communism is essentially planned economy in the government, meaning there's no businesses, there's no stores, everything is just run by the government. So the government owns all the resources, and the governments are the one to answer the 3 economic questions. So, for example, Cuba, North Korea, Soviet Union, and China. So, why do centrally planned economies often face the problems of poor quality goods, shortages, and unhappy citizens? And the answer is there's zero competition. If you think about it, right? Like, for example, if you think about, Speed, Math, and CS, right? We are a tutoring organization, right? We, of course, have competition. There's other organizations that you can go to get AP tutoring, right? So what we have to do is we have to basically outrun our competition. So in return, consumers will be getting, better productivity and a better resource. But when there's only one... think if Speed, Math, and CS was the only tutoring organization. What incentive would we have to increase our productivity, right? And additionally, central planners, if you're the only one in the government, you're not taking inspiration. You have a difficult time predicting what your consumers will prefer. So this is just a cool image I found, right? So even if you spend your whole life combating the forces of capitalism, you still might wind up on a t-shirt sold in a store owned by the Gap, right? So now let's move on to free market system, which is capitalism. So the characteristics of free market are that there's little government involvement in the economy, right? So this is for example, what we see in the US, right? The government isn't the one selling the bananas. They're not the one selling the iPhones. They're not the one selling the bread. It's all sold by stores. So individuals own the resources, and businesses will be the ones to answer the 3 economic questions. So the opportunity to make profit gives people incentive to produce quality items efficiently. And of course, because of this, there's competition, right? So there's a wide variety of goods available to consumers. So for example, you can see when you go into a store, there's so many different types of bread, right? You have your white bread, your brown bread, multi-grain. You have some that have more omega-3, less omega-3, some that are less costly, more costly. So there's a wide variety of goods available to consumers, right? So each consumer will have their own preference, and their preferences are being met because they can just choose any one of these wide varieties. And let's say that all the bread was low quality, right? And all the competition, they want to outlast their competition. So they want to make their goods high quality. So as a result of this, consumers get the highest qualities, the lowest prices, and the largest variety, which is good for consumers. So competition and self-interest work together to regulate the economy, right? Keep prices down, keep quality up. So some examples of free market, right? If a consumer wants smartphones, right? let's say you want like an iPhone from Apple, right? And only one company is making them. Let's say only Apple is making the phones, right? Other businesses will have the incentive to start making smartphones to earn profit. Like, for example, Samsung, right? If for example, they're making something else, let's say they're making like tablets, right? And they see that, oh, Apple is doing so good selling phones, right? And they're the only ones selling it. They will want to start making smartphones so they can get a piece of that pie, some sweet, sweet profit, right? So this leads to more competition, which means lower prices, better quality, more product variety, right? These are the three things. So, yeah. So most efficient production of the goods that the consumers want, produced at the lowest prices, highest quality. So the invisible hand is a common concept we'll use in economics, which is essentially means that the concept that society's goals will be met so long as individuals seek their own self-interest. Meaning that businesses just have to worry about their good that they're selling. And even if there's like, for example, a deficit in like the market or something, there'll be an invisible hand to essentially move it back to the regular economy. So, yeah. So society wants fuel-efficient cars. Profit-seeking producers will make more since consumers will be buying them, meaning that competition between firms results in lower prices, higher quality, and greater efficiency. Since the government doesn't need to get involved in the market, right, they can focus on their government stuff. So this is genuinely better, right? Like, we already saw from the Cold War, 1991, Soviet Union gone. Communism was inefficient. This is why most societies today have adapted to capitalism. It's just so much better, especially for consumers and also for producers, right? People want lower prices, people want higher quality, and businesses will have greater efficiency. So this is exactly what drives like innovators, right? Like us, for example, who do like AP tutoring, right? Let's say the government was offering AP tutoring. There's only going to be one place you can go to get that tutoring, right? So maybe they could charge like hundreds of dollars, and then you can get super low quality, and then they won't be efficient about it. The capitalism is the reason why you will have like things like us, right? Where we're completely free. We try to deliver the highest quality learning, and we're also like very efficient, right? Speed, essentially, right? So competition and self-interest act as an invisible hand which regulate the free market. So consumers don't have to worry about their prices, they don't have to worry about the quality, and they don't have to worry about the efficiency of markets. This is what the invisible hand is. So yeah, this is just a quote, right, by Adam Smith, right? He's the one who invented this concept of the invisible hand. So now let's go over mixed economies. This is the third type, right? So this is a system with free markets, but also some government intervention. And the truth is, all countries, including the US, will have mixed economies. You can't just be perfectly communism. You can be perfect communism. You can't be perfectly like capitalism. You'll essentially, So before we go there, right? So there's essentially, you can be more communism, like maybe the government has more involvement or the government has less involvement. But it's impossible to be either perfectly communism or perfectly capitalism. Now, let's go over an AP question, right? So essentially, unlike a market economy, a command economy uses more central planning and in economic decision making, right? This is somewhat true. So this could be the correct answer, right? Consumer sovereignty to make production decisions. This is not true, right? Consumers don't participate in the market. That's not how it works. Its resources are more efficiently used. We already saw that communism is inefficient. And price signals and economic decision making, the decisions are made by the government, right? And the popular vote in making resource allocation decisions, right? There's no popular vote, it's all the government. So the answer will be A, because it's all planned by the government. So productivity creates wealth, right? So you'll notice that newly developed countries, like for example, you see like countries in Africa, right? They were all like decolonized after like the Second World War, right? So they're still developing. So their economies might not be as great as, for example, like let's look at Britain, for example. They've been around. They've never been colonized. They've had plenty of time to develop, right? So countries with free markets, property rights, and the rule of law have historically seen greater economic growth because they're more productive, right? So this is just a very like funny image, right? So like just to give you an idea of how inefficient communism is, right? Look at this, right? So we have South Korea over here, right? They're capitalism, right? So they are basically fitting with the consumer, like what they want, right? So if they want they're essentially more efficient. So you'll see like everything is lit up here. Same thing with China. Although it's more communism, right? It's still efficient. Now, if you look at North Korea, right? It almost looked like there's a complete like gap in land. Like you'll notice here, it's literally the same color as the Yellow Sea. There's like zero lights whatsoever. And you'll see this as well. Like North Korea has a super low GDP. North Korea is communism and South Korea is capitalism. Look how much higher South Korea's GDP is. So this just gives you a very good idea of how inefficient communism may be. So now let's go over like probably the first like complicated graph you'll see. So don't really freak out yet, but so we'll have the product market, right? Which is a place where goods and services produced by businesses are sold to households. So like stores stores are a good example, right? And then we have the resource factor market, which is the place where resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship are sold to businesses. So this is more of like, you won't know, like us as consumers don't know about this as much, but businesses, there's also another market where they go get their resources. So we'll place our two markets like this, and then we'll have businesses and individuals like this, right? So we'll start off, right? Businesses will be putting goods and services into the product market, and they will get sold to individuals. And then individuals will spend in the product market, and the revenue goes to the businesses. So this is our first part of the circular flow model, right? So this is supply, this is demand. So now individuals, right, will give resources. So like this is essentially like the government up here, right? Individuals will give resources like in taxes or things like that, right? And the resources will be bought by the government. So these are the costs, right? Remember, profit is revenue minus costs. Costs are this is getting paid by the businesses. So it's going from the businesses' profit away to the resource market. And revenue is from the product market into businesses. So income, right, which is the amount that businesses have to pay to individuals. Individuals will give like labor to businesses in return for income. So in the middle, supply and demand. So the labor that individuals will provide is part of supply. And in the middle, we have the government who will tax on the product market and then give So government essentially can give money to either the product market or the resource market. And there's also public goods available by the government, right? So this is, for example, in communism, right? There will be no things. It's just the government giving public goods to everyone. And the businesses and individuals will pay taxes to the governments to pay for those public goods. So here we have it. This is the circular flow model. No need to memorize it, but just get a good idea of how it works, because it'll definitely come up later. Oh yeah, also subsidies can be given by the government to businesses to help them if they're struggling, and also transfer payments can be given to individuals in, for example, like bonds and things like that. So Yeah, so private sector, part of an economy run by individuals and businesses. Public sector is the amount that's controlled by the government. And factor payments, right, are the payment for factors of production. So like, for example, for consumers, rents, interest, right? And for businesses, like wages and profit. The wages they have to pay to consumers and the profit they get in return. And then transfer payments. When the government is redistributing the income. So for example, Social Security and welfare are two good examples of this. Like if we look back at our circular flow model, we'll see like transfer payments going to individuals. This comes in the form of, welfare and Social Security are two very good examples of this. And then subsidies are what the government pays to businesses. So if a business is struggling, or if a business is greatly desired, but they can't produce more because they don't have enough money to, the government will pay businesses to essentially be more efficient. So let's move on to topic 1.3, which is going to be our production possibilities curve. So I've been teasing this basically all lesson, but this is the part that will require practice. For up till now, it has been very theoretical what we've been doing, right? We've been talking about like businesses and stuff like that. Now we actually get into some questions that will appear on AP exam. And you'll see this in the homework as well, or in the practice. So the production possibilities curve using economic models, right? So the first step is to essentially explain the concept of words. Second is we'll use numbers as examples. And 3 is we'll generate the graphs from the numbers. So, and then we'll make generalizations using the graph. So before we do this, we'll come back. These 4 steps are important. This is how we will essentially draw our graphs, right, for the production possibilities curve. But what is the production possibilities curve? Let's go over this, right? The production possibilities curve, or frontier, like I mentioned earlier, PPC or PPF, right, is a model that shows essentially will compare two goods. It's a pretty simple curve. It's a curve between the two goods. On the x-axis, we can have one good. On the y-axis, we'll have another good. And this shows how we must choose how to allocate those two goods. So tying back to 1.1 with scarcity. And this model graphically demonstrates scarcity, trade-offs, opportunity costs, and efficiency. And we'll see this later when we start to graph points on the PPC. So the 4 key assumptions we make when doing a PPC is that only 2 goods can be produced, right? We're only going to be comparing 2 goods. So for example, if we think of Papa John's, right? Currently they sell a bunch of goods. But for the sake of drawing a PPC for Papa John's, we'll be comparing 2 goods. So we're going to assume they can only produce like calzones and pizzas. We'll actually use this example for a practice problem later. And then full employment of resources, meaning that the resources are being like fully used. And then there's also fixed resources, right? Resources that won't change. Like for example, the amount of cheese they get, the amount of bread they get, those are fixed. And then fixed technology, right? It isn't easier. You don't have better technology to produce a calzone than you do to have a pizza. The technology is fixed. So let's go into how we graph this, right? So in this case, we're looking at bikes versus computers, right? So bikes, so we're going to be comparing bikes and computers. Like the government, or not the government, sorry. The business is allocating resources to either produce bikes or computers. So if a business wants to focus on bikes, they can produce 14 bikes, but then they can't produce any computers. Furthermore, if they want to produce, like for example, 6 computers, then they can only produce 5 bikes. So you can see how we might graph this. This is essentially just points that we'll put on our graph. So each point represents a specific combination of goods that can be produced given full employment of resources. Now, let's graph it. Let's put bikes on the y-axis and computers on the x-axis. So in order to do this, right, we first set up our graph like this. We'll have bikes on the y-axis, computers on the x-axis. And we'll graph each one of our points. So those are all the points from the graph. And as you can see here, they kind of form like a curvature shape, right? There you go. There is our PPC for this company with bikes and computers. So how does the PPC graphically demonstrate the scarcity trade-offs, opportunity cost, and efficiency, right? This is because if we're gonna go more over this right now, this topic. But essentially, first let's talk about scarcity, right? There's a scarce amount of resources. So A, B, C, or D, or E is the max we can produce. We can't go outside this curve. This curve is essentially, think of this as like a boundary to how far we can go. Because we can't go outside, this essentially demonstrates scarcity. We have a limited amount of resources. And then trade-offs, of course, produce more bikes, you produce less computers. Produce more computers, you produce less bikes. Opportunity costs, like I mentioned earlier, this is easier if we go back to this. So in order to produce 2 computers, right, to go from 0 to 2, we have to pay the opportunity cost of 2 bikes. We could have produced 2 more bikes if we didn't want to sell 2 computers. But now that we're selling 2 computers, we are losing out on the ability to sell 2 bikes. That's our opportunity cost, right? Yeah. So, and efficiency essentially suggests, right? Think about this. If you have like A, B, C, and D, and E, demonstrate like how they demonstrate full efficiency, right? But if we go back to the table, right? And let's say a business was producing 0 computers and 8 bikes, right? That's inefficient. We already know that this point is on the PPC. So we know that they could have produced more bikes, or they could have produced computers. So any point that lies inside of this region that's bounded by the y-axis, x-axis, and PPC, like any point inside of the region here is inefficiency. And any point on the PPC, like on this line, is full efficiency. So under here, inefficiency, unemployment is what this inner area represents. And on the curve is efficient. So if we have a point out here, this is impossible and unattainable given our current resources. This represents scarcity. So these are some opportunity costs example of opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost of moving from point A to B is, of course, we produce 2 less bikes. B to D is that we produce 7 less bikes. And D to B is that we're missing out on those 4 computers. And so on and so forth, right? So, yeah. Because we're going from F to C, right? Like, this is actually an important example. There's no opportunity cost being paid. We're just becoming more efficient. And then, about point G, this is impossible, given our scarcity of resources. So now, let's think about 2 resources. Let's think about like a PPC that won't be curved. Like I mentioned earlier, calzones and pizzas. So if you think about it, this will just be a linear line, right? Because the opportunity cost from moving anywhere is always 1 calzone. So this is what we call constant opportunity cost. Resources are easily adaptable for producing either good. And result is a straight line PPC, which is of course not common. The reason we call it the production possibilities curve is that it's a curve. There we'll see like what's efficient and what's not. But let's say if we're looking at something like this, right? This is when we get into the concept of consumer goods versus capital goods, right? So pizza is a consumer good and robots are a capital good, right? You can invest more in pizza, right? So you'll be producing more for your consumers. But that just means that you're not holding investments that you could be investing in robots, right? But for example, if you produce 3 robots and 10 pizza, you're not able to sell as much pizza, but you're making robots that will help you make that pizza. So this is the concept of, law of increasing opportunity cost. As you produce more of any good, the foregone production of another good, which is our opportunity cost, will increase. So as we go one robot to the next, we can see first we lose 1 pizza, then we lose 3 pizza, then we lose 6 pizza, then we lose 10 pizza. So this is the prime example of, in businesses, what a PBC is used for. Capital goods, something that could be used to produce your consumer goods, lower your costs, versus increasing your revenue by just producing the consumer goods straight up. So, yeah. So the result is a bowed out, right? We'll have a convex PBC, which will be a curve. So, for example, if we have corn and wheat, right? We're using the same land. There's no new technology. So it'll just be a straight line, right? But, so, because they're two like similar types of goods. But if we're considering a cactus versus pineapples, right? These are two goods from completely different categories. So typically these ones will be like a bowed out PBC versus like one like this, which is just a straight line PBC. Let's go over an AP question, right? So this one is comparing capital goods versus consumer goods, right? So for example, like this is where a PBC is most commonly used. So let's look at the options. The diagram above shows the production possibilities curve for an economy that produces only consumption and capital goods. All of the following statements about this economy are true, except the following. So let's look at see which one is false, right? Producing at point Z results in the underutilization of resources. We already know anything inside the PBC is inefficient. So this is true. The combination represented by point Y is unattainable given the scarcity of resources. Like we covered, the PBC also represents scarcity. So anything outside the PBC is impossible to produce given the scarcity of resources. So B is also right. So resources are fully utilized at point W and X. They lie on the PBC, they lie on the line, so this is also true. Producing at point X will result in greater economic growth than will producing at point W, right? So, yeah. So this essentially means that producing at point X in the long run will be more efficient than producing in point W. So this one actually requires some thought because this is going back to W. If you think about it, W is on the line, but if we look at the point, they're not producing any capital goods, meaning they're not producing any robots, they're not making any investment, versus X, which is they're sacrificing producing more of the pizza in order to make more investments, make more robots, which in this case you want a balance of both. Like you can't just be producing only robots because then you're just going to be the same thing as if you produce consumption goods. So essentially being on either of these lines, right, it represents inefficiency. You want a mix of both. So D is also true. And X represents the most efficient combination of the two goods that can be produced by this economy. Like I said, you could always be like more efficient. So you could go up and down. So this one is the false one. So yeah, E is the one that is false. So let's go over another one, right? If resources were perfectly substitutable in all activities, which of the following would be true? The output of all goods could be increased with zero opportunity cost, right? This is not true, right? Because resources were perfectly substitutable, meaning we're at full efficiency. So no. The production possibilities curve would be a straight line. This one looks pretty enticing because if the resources were perfectly substitutable, like for example our corn and wheat example, or our calzone and pizza example, right? A pizza is literally just an invert calzone, so they're completely substitutable. So option B looks enticing, but always remember on the AP test, read all the options. Specialization and mutually beneficial trade would be impossible. this is, of course, false. No country or individual would have a comparative advantage in any activity. This is also false, but we'll touch on comparative advantage in topic 1.4, right? Scarcity of resources would be eliminated. Scarcity never goes. So clearly the answer here is B. So now let's skip this one for now because we are a little behind. So now let's go on to shifting the production possibilities curve. So once again, these are our four sort of key assumptions. But in this case, the PBC uses these two ones. These two green bold ones are the ones we'll be using. So let's look at the three shifters of this graph. Because the graph won't just be a constant graph. We will be shifting it around. Because if it's just a constant graph, what's the point of even drawing it? So first is change in resource quantity or quality. Our scarcity is either getting reduced or increased. So that will either, for example, if the resource quantity, let's say if we have less resources now, the PBC will shift inward, right? We'll be able to produce less bikes and less computers overall. That's one of the shifters. Second is change in technology. If we get more efficient, we can produce more. So our PBC will shift outward. And then change in trade, right? The whole concept of trade is that the land and natural resources will be different. So for example, if we look in Africa, like in Mali, for example, there's a lot of mines there. They can mine very easy. It costs less to mine. Versus here in for example, if we look at the US, for example, so if we look at the US, for example, it's harder to just mine, right? So it'll cost less for Africa, but for us, we produce corn super easily. It's one of our biggest productions. So we could trade with Africa. We could go coal for corn, right? And that allows for more consumption, shifting out our PBC. So this is computers and pizzas. So what would happen if there are more population, right? They're essentially, let's say there's more people. This means that if we think back to our other four factors, right? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. This increases labor. You have more people to hire. So this will shift the PBC outward. So there's more workers, more human labor. So what if there's a technology improvement in pizza ovens? This is specifically talking about pizza, right? So we can't produce more computers, right? We can only produce more pizzas. So it'll look something like this, where only the pizza side will be expanded. And then, so capital versus consumer goods, right? Another common way to use a PBC is to demonstrate the trade-off between producing capital and consumer goods, right? So if we look at Panama, for example, this is what their current PBC looks like. They favor producing consumer goods. So in order to produce capital goods, right, they need to essentially invest more. So in the future, right, their whole thing will be shifted outwards because they'll be making more profit. But if we think about Mexico and they're shifting, they favor capital goods. In the future, right, they will be expanding the consumer goods as well because the more robots, you'll exponentially be able to produce more. So that's why capital goods can be very useful. So from this AP question earlier that we covered, that's why W and X aren't equally, that's why X is more efficient than W because you're producing capital goods. So let's use, we can actually skip this for now. Okay, so let's go over a couple practice questions. So question 1, new computer making technology, right? This will shift computers. We can make more computers. We can't make any more pizzas. Computers will shift outwards like this. Decrease in the demand for pizza. This means that we won't be producing as many pizzas. So the curve actually doesn't shift. Because if you think about it, the PBC is representing resources. It's representing supply, right? Supply and demand are two different aspects, right? So essentially, we just go up and down the curve if you look at this, right? So if a business before was producing a lot of pizzas, not a lot of computers, they're just going to go towards and produce more computers. Like so. Let's say a mad cow disease kills 85% of cows. And let's say the cows are being used on the pizza, right, to produce the cheese. So a shift inward this time because there's less resources. So we'll lose all of that. But it won't affect computers. We don't use cows in computers. At least I don't think we do. But yeah. So now if there's a destruction of power plants, which essentially means less energy to make the stuff, this means that there's a decrease in resources, which will essentially mean that you can't produce capital goods nor consumer goods. So this will decrease the PPC for both. Now, if there's faster computer hardware, that means that capital goods will be produced faster, right? So this shift, the quality of the resource shifts outwards. So now let's say many workers are unemployed. This is once again labor, but this time it's going down. So this will shift the whole curve inside. It's just a point inside the curve, right? So unemployment just represents simply the business. Think about this. It's called the PPC because it's production possibilities. What the business could produce. So the business is just a point on this. So they will just move inside. So more increase in education, right? This will mean you can produce more, right? Yeah. So then now let's move on to topic 1.4, which is comparative advantage. This will involve a little bit of math, right? So in here, we're going to be looking at trade. So why do people trade? Let's go over this. Why would people want to trade items before? I already gave an example, right? So what things would you have to go without? If you think about it, in Africa, they have a lot of access to mining and things like that. Without that, we would have to go without any of any diamonds, without any coal and stuff like that. And everything we can't produce in the US is essentially gone, right? If you think about it, in China, we get a lot of stuff like computers, we get clothes and stuff. All of that is no longer here. So yeah, so clothes, cars, cell phones, bananas, healthcare, all of this is gone because we can't produce that here in the US. So the point is that everyone specializes in the production of some goods and services and trades for others. So for example, the US is very good at producing corn, right? Our land is super it's fertile and meant for producing corn, right? So in this case, we will just go full in on corn. We'll just produce a bunch of corn because we are the most efficient holder, and instead we'll just trade for everything else. So yeah, so this is just right. So yeah, more access to trade means more choices and a higher standard of living, right? So just for context, right? These are 10 goods that we import typically, right? Vehicles, electric machinery, and other stuff, right? All of this stuff is imported. We don't produce this here. Instead, we produce things that we're good at, such as corn. So absolute and comparative advantage, right? So per unit opportunity cost. We've already talked about opportunity cost, which is simply the amount you have to pay to the amount you have to pay to move from one point on the PPC to another, right? This one is the per unit opportunity cost, right? So for example, if you could make 4 more computers, but instead you lost 2 bikes, your opportunity cost per unit opportunity cost is 0.5 bike. And we'll be using this to determine terms of trade. So if it costs you $50 to produce 5 t-shirts, per unit cost is just $10, right? And if we take money out of the equation, instead of producing 5 shirts, you could produce 10 hats, right? But you're producing one more shirt in exchange for 2 hats. So 2 hats one shirt costs 2 hats. So yeah, one hat costs 1 half shirt. So we'll be using this to essentially determine terms of trade. So in this case, right, Ronald McDonald can produce 20 pizzas or 200 burgers. And these are 2 points on the PVC. Like this is the y-intercept and this is the x-intercept. And same for them. So their graphs will look like this, right? So if we look at Ronald's opportunity cost for 1 pizza in terms of burgers given up, right? Ronald's opportunity cost is that, like, to produce 1 more pizza, he has to give up 10 burgers, right? And in order to make 1 burger, he gives up 1/10 of a pizza. So same thing for Farmer John, right? Farmer John, to produce 1 pizza, he'll give up 2 burgers. And to produce 1 burger, he'll give up 1/2 of a pizza. So, yeah. So in this case, the idea is, right, if you look at it, Ronald McDonald, using their current resources, it costs them more to produce pizzas, right? Like, it costs them 10 burgers to produce pizzas, right? But for Farmer John, Papa John's, it only costs 2 burgers to make 1 pizza. So, in this case, we would want Papa John to be making the pizzas and Ronald McDonald to be making the burgers. Because once again, if you look at it, right, to make 1 burger, Papa John has to give up half of a pizza, right? Versus Ronald McDonald giving up 1/10 of a pizza. They're barely giving anything up. So, if Ronald McDonald's opportunity cost for producing burgers is like their per unit opportunity cost is less, that's what they're going to be producing. So, yeah, Ronald McDonald has a comparative advantage in the production of burgers, and Papa John has a comparative advantage in the production of pizza. So, absolute advantage is just the producer who can produce the most output. So, if we're going back, right, Ronald McDonald doesn't have an absolute advantage. They can both produce the same number of burgers. It's just that, and Ronald and Papa John can produce more pizzas. So they have a higher, like, absolute advantage, right? But the thing is, we think about it like this. What is their per unit opportunity cost that they're giving? And that's how we determine terms of trade, right? So yeah, absolute advantage, produce most output, requires the least amount of resources. So Papa John has the absolute advantage in pizzas, right? Because he can produce 100 and Ronald can only make 20. But for comparative advantage, the producer with the lowest opportunity cost, per unit opportunity cost. So Ronald has a comparative advantage in burgers because he's giving up less to make it. Typically, he'd have to, Papa John's, I don't know why I keep saying Farmer John, but Papa John would have to give up half of a pizza to produce a burger. But Ronald McDonald only has to give up 1/10 of a pizza. So he has a lower per unit opportunity cost. So countries should trade if they have a relatively lower opportunity cost. So if we think about the US versus Brazil, right? In sugar versus wheat, right? So if you think US has the absolute advantage in both, right? But in order to produce 1 sugar, the US has to give up 1 wheat, right? As we can see from our line here, it's linear, right? But Brazil, in order to produce 1 sugar, they only have to give up half of a wheat. So what we say here, US, right? Okay, yeah. So US, you produce all the wheat. Brazil will produce all the sugar. because it costs less for us to produce it, right? So, and then we'll just trade for who needs what. So, U.S. comparative advantage in wheat, and Brazil will be producing sugar. So, yeah. So, what country should export sugar? Brazil can produce more sugar, right? So, they are scarce in wheat, right? So, they have to get it from the U.S. So, they sell the sugar to the U.S. So, Brazil is the country that should export sugar. The U.S. exports wheat, and then Brazil is importing wheat. So here are a couple tricks for determining comparative advantage, right? Output means that other goes over, right? So if you think about it, right? If we say beef, right? So Japan to produce beef, other goes over, right? So CDs will go over. So it'll become 4/2. So Japan has to give up 2 CDs, and whereas Canada only has to give up 2/3. So, and then for input questions like so, right? This is trippy. This can be trippy because for this represents time. So it's important that you read the question, right? So, like we mentioned earlier, the United States takes less time to produce corn. So, in order to produce one bread, they're giving up one bread takes them 4 hours. So they're giving up the 2 corn they could have produced versus France, who's just giving up 2/3 of the corn they could have produced. So we say US, you produce corn, France, you produce bread. So yeah, terms of trade. Both countries can benefit from trade if they have relatively lower opportunity costs. So this is the agreed upon conditions. Essentially, a country, they will trade only if they get more benefit out of importing that good. So, for example, if we trade so we say Kenya and India, right? So we say like so. So we already know Kenya is the one, like this will soon become like off the top of your head, you'll instantly know this, right? Kenya, to produce 1 pineapple, they give up 1/3 of a radio. India has to give up 1 pineapple to produce only 1 radio. So Kenya is the one producing pineapples. India is the one producing radios. Pretty simple. But yeah, so who has comparative advantage and who goes in radio, right? So yeah. So now let's look at terms of trade. So essentially, India and Kenya will be trading. Like, for example, if we think like Kenya will essentially give India 20 pineapples for, let's say, 15 radios in return, right? So that could be a term of trade, right? But we have to decide if it's beneficial for both countries. So if we make a graph, right? So we'll load this data from earlier, right? So essentially, India will import pineapples so long as it costs less to trade with Kenya versus them just making it themselves. So for example, if 1 pineapple costs 1 radio, but let's say Kenya is like, okay, we're only going to give you 20 pineapples if you give us 30 radios in return, right? So in this case, India is going to have to give up 1.5 radios. So it'll actually just cost more to trade with Kenya. So they will just produce it on their own. They won't agree. So yeah, so Kenya wants radios, India wants pineapples, right? So if Kenya wants radios so long as they pay less than 3 pineapples to get that radio. So if the terms for trade for 1 radio is greater than 3 pineapples, then Kenya is worse off and they'll just make radios on their own. India wants pineapples, right? So if they have to pay more than one radio to get one pineapple, right? Then India is worse off and should make pineapples on their own. So in this case, right, we have two conditions. We have to, for one radio, we have to essentially trade more than one pineapple and less than 3 pineapples. So 1 for 2 will benefit both, right? So India, normally they would have to give up a radio to produce a pineapple. But now they're only giving up half a radio, so it's beneficial for them. And Kenya, normally they would have to give up 3 pineapples to trade for 1 radio, but now they're only giving up 2. So it's beneficial for both. And this is exactly why in the real world we do trading. So yeah, so a quicker way is to look for which one is in between, right? So for example, if we look at Norway and Slovakia, right? 1 corn for 1 equals 2 wheat and 1 wheat. So we just decide a value in between. Like 1C, so we can produce 1C for 1.5 wheat. That is a good trading. So that is the amount that is essentially what we'll do to look for a good trade. This is essentially just a quick approach that we'll use on the AP test. So let's actually skip these for now because we're a little behind. So let's create a chart with. So comparative advantage. What we'll do is identify if it's an input or output question, right? Who has the absolute advantage, and then who has the comparative advantage, and identify which one they should specialize. So Sarah gives 2 haircuts or 1 perm an hour, and Megan gives 3 haircuts, or 2 perms per hour. Megan has the absolute advantage in both. She's producing more haircuts and more perms. But for Sarah, she only has to give up half a perm in order to produce a haircut, whereas Megan has to give up 1 point. In order to produce a haircut, she has to give up 2/3 of a perm. So 2/3 is more than 1/2, meaning that Sarah specializes in haircuts, Megan specializes in perms. So that's just a general idea. So now let's look at input versus output questions, right? Number caught in 1 day, that's output, right? Deer and antelope are being sold, right? And months to produce 1, right? Months is time. So consumption so goods are outputs. So this is an output question. Months is time. So this is an input question. And acres is land. So this is also an input question. So it's going to go output. So output, input, and input. All right. Topic 1.5. Cost and benefit analysis, right? So first, is it possible to prevent wildfires in California forever? Obviously not. And of course, ensure that no one ever speeds on the freeway. Or like create a research station on Mars, stop pollution, and stuff like that. Yes, but in order to do this, right, it costs more to do this than we actually get in return, right? So if we want to prevent wildfires in California forever, right? We'll do a bunch of safety measures in all the forests, like everything, but that resource could be spent somewhere else. And of course, you're much better off spending those resources on actually making goods than you are preventing these problems. So the costs outweigh the benefits, so we don't do them. So what type of costs should you include when making decisions, right? So given the following assumptions, make a rational choice in your own self-interest. Hold everything constant, right? You want to visit your friend for a week. You will return Sunday night, right? So for this example, right, does it cost more? Do you want to visit your friend is your benefit, but the fact that you're missing so much time is your cost. So you'll want to see which one is more. So essentially that is the idea here. So yeah, you work every weekday earning 100 per day. You have 3 flights to choose from. So if we use cost benefit analysis, right? On Thursdays, a night flight is $275, right? So yeah. So you are essentially, you work every weekday 10. So Monday, you can work Monday, Tuesday, you can work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday before getting on your flight. So you have 4 days. So you're earning $400 and then you're getting on the flight. On Friday, right, you could still only produce for 4 days, right? So this is obviously worse off, right? 400 minus 300, that's only $100 versus the 125 we got here. Versus the Friday night flight, right? Which essentially is that like if you take the Friday night flight, you can work for your full 5 days, get the $500 and have a $175 benefit. But that just means less time you can spend with your friend. So this is essentially like making these decisions is what we call cost benefit analysis. So trade-offs versus opportunity cost. All decisions involve trade-offs. When all the alternatives that we give up when we make the choice, right? Opportunity cost is the most desirable alternative given up when you make a choice. So the trade-offs when going to college, right? This can be like you can work on a job. For example, you could be making money, but in return, you'll be smarter. So you'll be more beneficial. So you can get higher wages. So, and then the opportunity cost of going to college, of course, is just the most desirable alternative. You're working at a job that pays you better than what you're getting in college. So yeah, so like this is like the economies of college, and we have to choose two. So we'll use cost benefit analysis. We want good grades. Like let's say this is super important to us versus like getting enough sleep. So if we choose like these two, for example, we're giving up on social life. So this is essentially the concept of cost benefit analysis. So explicit costs versus implicit costs, right? Economists examine both explicit and implicit costs. And explicit costs are the traditional out-of-pocket costs associated with making a decision. So examples being the price of a movie ticket, and implicit costs are the opportunity costs of making a decision. So explicit costs, these are more like physical, tangible costs, right? So, for example, if you're going to the movies, right, you're paying money. That is your explicit cost. But an implicit cost is an opportunity cost. You could have been working at home, right? You could have been studying for your exam. You could have gotten a better score, right? That is your implicit cost, right? So we'll talk about this more in Unit 3 of Micro, right? But this will be important to just keep in the back of your head for now. So yeah, So now let's talk about the benefits and cost on a graph, right? Assume that we're buying slices of pizza at a sporting event, like this, right? We will have, this is like our marginal benefit graph, right? So we will have like the benefit or cost in units and the quantity of pizza, right? So we'll look at this later when we get to like Unit 3 once again, right? This is our marginal benefit or marginal revenue, right? Each slice of pizza gives you less and less additional benefit, right? But so you have to decide, right? You can get more and more benefit from getting pizza, right? But if you eat too many, it's not worth the cost. So if we have a marginal cost curve, for example, it'll cost you more, right? Of course, there is a fixed cost, right? Like explicit costs are fixed, right? You're paying a certain amount. But the marginal cost is, you're gonna be too full. You might throw up, right? That is an implicit cost. So if we look at this, right? if you think about it in a graph, X marks the spot, right? You will keep getting pizza so long as marginal benefit is not lower than it is higher than marginal cost. So you'll eat 5 pizzas, but then after you eat 5 pizzas, you'll be like, hey, it costs more to eat the next pizza than it does than benefit I do get in return. So you'll stop at 5. And so this is your equilibrium quantity. So yeah, 5 sauces is the optimal amount. So why is it not 3? The reason it isn't 3 is although you are getting more benefit, right? In this case, we're thinking about it as an area, right? This area right here is your total benefit, right? Marginal benefit minus marginal cost. This is just a slope graph, right? We have to take the area in between to actually like get your total benefit. So in this case, we're just getting a smaller area, smaller cutout of stuff we could have been getting. Like all of this is just lost. So that's why we don't just want to have 3 pizzas, even though we'll gain more marginal benefit from it, right? So yeah, not enough. The marginal benefits still exceed the marginal costs, meaning that you can still get more benefit from the same costs. So this will probably conclude our review of Unit 1 for today. We have one last topic, 1.6, but I think this will go better with Saturday's lesson, which will be talking about Unit 2, which will cover supply and demand. So I think this is a good note to leave on, right? Marginal benefit, marginal cost. And we'll get our study next time. So I hope to see you on Saturday, and good luck with your practice and your AP exams. All right, see you.